Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to let Theo go first.
Hello, everyone. I'm Theo Eschart from Henry Stewart Events, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar sponsored by Brainrider, Scaling Creative Output with Agility and Flexibility. During the session, please send through your questions at any point using the questions box, which you can open by clicking on the question mark at the top of your GoToWebinar window. Also, a reminder that a recording of this session will be sent to you tomorrow, so you can view it again at your own pace. And now it's my great pleasure to pass you over to Scott Armstrong, CEO and partner at Brainrider. Thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Theo, and thanks, Henry Stewart. And even more importantly, thanks for everybody who's joining us in today's webinar, Scaling Creative Output with Agility and Flexibility. I like the webinar subject because we're all under pressure to deliver more, faster, and at a lower cost while maintaining high standards and meeting organizational objectives. And that's not an easy feat. But the real challenge is, in order to do that, how do you build a scalable model that balances quality, speed, and budget, that triangle that we all live by, as demand fluctuates from your organization, from your marketing and creative needs? As Theo said, my name is Scott. I'm from Brainrider. And I'm here moderating this topic because it's core to what Brainrider does when we're helping our clients flexibly adjust to resourcing needs and creative delivery needs so they can spend time creating more and spending less. But it's not a sales presentation today. It's a discussion with three amazing professionals. And one of the ways that we help make that happen is by bringing people together. And so in today's call, we brought together a client, a creative operations expert, and a global creative studio um, who are going to talk a little bit about all of their priorities in working together to deliver against that triangle. But first, I want to encourage questions from webinar participants and discussion right from the start. So you'll see a little question section in your GoToWebinar panel, and we would love you to use it. We want you to feel like you're part of today's discussion. It's a safe space for learning and collaboration amongst the awesome people who always attend Henry Stewart events and the three people that I have on the call who have graciously agreed to share stories from their experience. So ask away. We want to include you. Now, when you're scaling creative output, there are some common roadblocks. Often what I hear when I'm at conferences and events and on webinars is challenges with limited internal bandwidth during peak periods of output, managing costs and unpredictable timelines and budgets, including the executive sponsorship that sometimes drives those timings and budgets, difficulty in managing global creative output efficiently, communication, trust, and operational gaps with internal and external resources. Communication is always key, and operations excellence always key. And then challenges in setting up, resourcing, and managing nearshore resources and external resources. Those are a lot of challenges, but getting it right is worth it. It means successfully balancing quality, speed, and budget while delivering for your organization. You are all heroes. So pat yourself on the back because the jobs that we do to deliver is hard work. And sometimes it can feel real lonely, and sometimes webinars feel real lonely. So I promise I'll get into a discussion and stop nattering on here fairly quickly. But I wanted to celebrate you for wanting to tackle this question and learn and really learning from the experience of these three awesome pros on how to do it better. And when I talk about three, I'm going to share a slide just for a second, just to sort of put that into perspective. So it's really this thought, right? Where a really functioning creative or studio model combines the client and creative teams that are delivering internally. The Brainrider creative ops team is how we do it, but there's always an ops team that's involved. And then the new secret power is to tap into global creatives or global creative studios. So there's a bunch of triangles that we use when we build strategies and work through opportunities with clients. This is definitely one that I want you to keep in mind as to why all three players are on the call today. Um, I'm going to introduce them. I will get there so they can share their experience of learning. But I also want to start with you. So, Theo, if you could put up a poll, I'm just going to ask a poll question for the audience, which is really, are you considering nearshoring? And you don't have to be considering nearshoring to be in today's webinar. You're going to learn lots regardless. But just to get a sense of where the questions or interest is lying, how many people are thinking about doing it in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, in the next couple of years as a possibility, or sometime in the future, or not at all? Go ahead. I'll give you a second to fill in the poll question, and then we'll get going with introducing. Yeah, those results are getting a little closer to what I would expect. It's about 50-50 in people who are considering it as an option, particularly if you are a mid-sized client organization who hasn't done it before. Or a mid-sized agency who hasn't done it before, it can be really daunting, the idea of tackling it. And we've all heard horror stories, and we experience horror stories of offshoring gone wrong and not necessarily exposed to the difference between the two. So I'm going to give another 15, 20 seconds for poll questions. So if you haven't answered yet, go right ahead. I'll share the results, and then we'll move on into some introductions. You can hear from today's panelists. Okay, so I think you should be able to see those results. It's about 40% of you are considering it, and 60% haven't thought about it at all. So we'll try to balance our commentary around that in the webinar as a whole. Stacy, Chelsea, Federico, thank you very much for joining everybody in today's webinar. Stacy, you're here today sharing your experience as a client perspective, particularly around objectives and budgets and resourcing, making things happen. Why don't you start off with a little bit about your story? I've known you forever. I'm such a big fan. Why don't you start off with a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so I'm the marketing director with Purolator, and just for those of you joining from the US, I just wanted to clarify it's Purolator, the Canadian-based company, which is a courier freight, a logistics company, not Purolator, the oil filter company, which I know exists in the US. So that'll be context to some of the answers because the last few years have been very tumultuous in our industry and supply chain. So it's definitely led to some of the changes and the scaling that we'll talk about in this webinar. As Scott mentioned, I've known the Brainrider team for a long time, and Scott for a long time. And I'm really excited to be here today and to kind of share some of the experiences that we've had with this group. You're on mute, Scott.
This will be a regular problem for me. Let's move to Chelsea. You've got some terrific creative operations experience and client support experience. What's your story, Chelsea?
Hi everyone. I'm Chelsea. I'm the managing director here at Brainrider. So I oversee all their operations, and I've really been working the past almost 2 years now, kind of building out this studio model with Scott and Nolan. But my whole background actually has been in production since I first started. So I have a ton of experience kind of working within different creative workflows, and I understand creative execution and so it's been a really fun thing for me kind of building out this studio model, just in kind of picking, what I envision some of the best parts that have worked in all these different workflows that I've been a part of and putting them all in one place. So it's been really fun, and I'm excited to continue rolling it out and seeing where it takes us.
Stacy mentioned she's from the Toronto area. Chelsea, where are you located?
I'm based in New York. I'm in Brooklyn.
And thanks for joining us today. I'm going to call you Fed because I call you Fed all the time. Fed,
Yes,
you bring a global studio perspective into this conversation. Why don't you share your story with everybody?
yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Federico. I'm originally from Argentina. I come from. I'm an engineer, so it's a bit of a strange, great to be working in marketing and creative ops. But I started my career in Argentina. Then I moved to London. I lived there for 5 years. I started working on marketing side, so client side, and then I moved to agency side when I was in London, and then I came back to Buenos Aires, and I set up a global studio, actually a creative studio, and then I met Scott and Nolan and Chelsea approximately a year ago, I think, and we started working together. So my background is marketing and creative operations as well. I'm an engineer, so I'm quite keen on always optimizing workflows, as Chelsea was saying. And for us, that is a key part of us functioning as a global team together and delivering in time and shape.
Amazing. And thank you, Fed, for joining us as
Thank you, Charles.
well. I want to remind everybody in the webinar, you can submit your questions. You can pose them to a specific person. You can just pose them in general. They can be about client issues, creative operations issues, creative issues, global issues, anything around really scaling what you're getting done. Now, Stacy, let me start with a question for you. What kind of creative demands have increased for your team in the last few years, and how has that impacted internal bandwidth?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that we're in the supply chain space because it's been a key factor in some of the things that we've need to pivot on over the last few years. And I think Scott, we've talked a lot about this, just how much the last 5 years has impacted the industry. Like from COVID to massive changes in globalization, tariffs, changing political landscape, a lot of knowledge about product sourcing. It's been a really eventful ride. And being in marketing over that time it's been a constant state of adoption, like adapt to different messaging and at the same time a big point of education with customers and prospects. Because I think up until the last few years, the behind the scenes of supply chain has been a very sort of unknown, but it's suddenly been brought out to the forefront as pretty much everybody has been talking about it. So it's been for us critical in kind of being on top of trends and acting really quickly to be part of different conversations. I think we've been putting together content and webinars ourselves on education as the conversation is changing. So sometimes we have a very short window to put all of that together and really make sure that we're getting in front of customer questions and making sure that we're placed and positioned correctly in any kind of global discussion. So it's been a big part of reactiveness at the same time as you're doing proactive planning, because you can't lose your marketing schedule, your marketing plan. But at the same time, you're reacting to market. So it's been very, very big part of how we've responded over the last few years. You're on mute again, Scott.
Constant change and constant pressure, right? And changing budgets. It's the crazy thing about marketing is budgets are not always in sync with the marketing need. So,
Mm-hmm.
team goes, the journey that you just talked about covers through COVID, it covers through inflation, it covers through tariffs, it covers through financial meltdown. Like there's a whole journey for supply chain as a company, and then a journey for marketing and the supply chain,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very education based marketing, although you've got a broad set of targets. You're targeting everything from the consumer to the most sophisticated supply chain people in the world with flexing budgets. How much change have you seen in the marketing priority side from your
Yeah.
team?
Yeah, no, it's constantly changing, especially when in marketing, you have a certain amount of things that you get the budget assigned, October the year before, and you have to plan your year, and there's a certain amount of things that you commit to in the beginning of the year that are contractual. And then there's a number of things that you do through the year that are responsive. And that budget is sometimes very difficult to pull back and forth because once you've
Right.
contractually committed to things, even though it may not be the right thing for you at that time, like given some of the changes that are happening in the commercial landscape. So that's been a really interesting part is shifting that budget after a certain amount of commitments are made, and trying to be as flexible as we can to like I said, be reactive because has been a very big portion. Reaction to market has been a very big portion of our activities over the last few years. And then even when you plan to have reaction, it is very difficult to implement in the time.
Right.
So
Right.
you plan a certain amount of your budget to be, the back of pocket in case things happen. And some years there have been so many in case things happen that you've had to completely pivot. And that's certainly happened to us.
Well, and we felt that from a flexibility and relationship delivery perspective. Your team's needs are different, not just year to year, but quarter to quarter, and how we're managing the budget together, what the workflow is, what the actual work is itself. Um, Chelsea, for you, how does workflow optimization play a role in trying to deliver against cost, speed, and creative quality?
I'd say it probably plays the biggest role in managing those things. Really, just because workflow is going to be everything. It's how your project runs from briefing, getting a brief to doing the budgets to actually executing the work and so on. So, immediately when a project goes wrong, the first thing you're going to look at is, where was the breakdown and what happened and how can we be more efficient? So, you know, I think having a really structured workflow in place that's consistent and adaptable is extremely important in those things. If you have these processes in place and the teams are aligned on following those processes and know what to do, everything's just going to run much smoother. And as I'm saying, it should be structured. I also feel like workflows also need to be adaptable. They can't be that rigid just because, like Stacy was saying, things happen and they change and you make all these plans and then something happens and you need to kind of figure out how to pivot and what to do next. And, so it's good to have processes in place, but at the same time, there needs to be room for flexibility for them, to account for those changes. So, yeah, I mean, I think having workflows and being able to optimize them is probably the most important thing you can do as an agency if you really want to be able to be efficient in all those areas. And with cost and resourcing, it all is intertwined.
Flexibility is one of the big parts of the journey that we've been on together for the past few years. And adding Fed's team into the mix has really allowed us to deliver capacity and capability on a more flexible model. Chelsea, what's your process for matching the right studio and resources to a given client or client project need? How does that process work when it's an external team that hasn't maybe even been planned for when we started out the year?
Yeah. So in regards to that, all the studios that we partner with have been vetted by us. They're part of our network. It's a trusted network that we've built out, and we're actively investing and constantly, bringing in new partners and iterating on. And we put a lot of effort into growing and building the relationship with our studios. So when a brief comes in or an ask comes from the client, resourcing is actually much easier and efficient because we already have this relationship with our studios. So, it really becomes about just matching exactly what the client's looking for with, the studio that, has, strengths in those areas, the same style and a good chemistry. So, you know, again, I think a lot of the way that we're resourcing comes from us building these relationships with our studios, and
Hmm.
just understanding exactly what their capabilities are and what their strengths are, and matching that with what the client, needs, what their budget is, and who we think, will work best with that client.
Yeah, you've done it. If you build those relationships and you vet that talent, then you really do have the ability to respond flexibly with the right solution for the client. You're not offering, what do I have? You're offering, hey, this is what the network can deliver. Fed, can you help people understand the kind of talent that's available to you on your team and sort of how you're delivering global creative standards, North American creative standards, North American brand awareness when your teams are executing?
Yes. So we are based in Buenos Aires, which has always been, I would say, a creative hub within Latin America. There's big companies, part of big holdings that have like creative production hubs here. For example, Media Monks has like 800 people
Hmm.
working here. There's always been a really good source of creative talent here in Buenos Aires. And in terms of what the work that we do for Brainrider and for Purolator, we have like really good design talent here. We have like from our perspective, we have a really you know super detail oriented head of design who is responsible of resourcing the best possible resources for the design team, and that's we try to I always try to, have a standard that is a global standard, not just
Hmm.
like Argentinian standard or Latin American standard. I worked in the UK. I worked in design
Right.
agencies before, so and I always had a passion for design and for creative. So I know what the global standard is, and I try to just like have that as the norm, so to say, of everything that comes out from the studio. Um, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, Argentina has a good reputation of having like really good creative talent, and the good thing about being in Argentina, and maybe we come to that later, but the time zone is key for us because we're only
Right.
like 1 hour or 2 hours time difference, and that robust workflows that Chelsea was talking about that sometimes can go wrong, and you might need to have some flexibility just to jump on a quick call, or to be able to write something on Slack on or whatever messaging service that we have, and knowing that the person like on the other side is only 1 hour or 2 hours away from in terms of time, but it's also an energy. If you're talking to someone, and
Right.
it's like really early in the morning here, and it's like super late at night over there, the different energies makes it more difficult for communicating. So that's something that's good.
Yeah, I think there's lots in that answer that you just shared. Like you're actually positioned to be really sometimes even easier than West Coast to East Coast or East Coast to West Coast in terms of communication and availability. What Chelsea and I noticed when we were in Buenos Aires, and really when we were working closely together with you, Fed, and your team, is that it is a global creative standard and it's a very deep creative pool in Buenos Aires. So it's not even Argentina, it's really Buenos Aires. And Buenos Aires is a city like New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, Miami, Toronto, Vancouver, London. Like these are creative capitals of the world with people who think globally in terms of design and communication, advertising and marketing. And you really get a sense of the depth of that pool, because the larger global corps have been working with studio teams in those markets for a long time. And the larger agencies are now actually less transparently behind the scenes sending lots of work down there. So this model has really allowed us to bring your talent, your team's talent, more comfortably into a client relationship. Stacy, let me move back to you and really say, when you're thinking about evaluating partners to work with, what are some of the things that matter most to you when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to resource for the next 12 months. I've got a budget. I've got some ingoing priorities. If there's one thing I know is that the plans are going to change, how do you sort of think about finding partners to help you manage that?
Yeah, it's definitely, it's the sense of flexibility is really key. And even in like the smoothest of years, there's still a lot of, back and forth that happens and a lot of change that happens. So for us to have a longer term partner, it really is about finding, someone who will work with us in terms of with a fair amount of flexibility in terms of resourcing, because it's very difficult for us to predict we'll need X amount of resources in a certain time frame. And I know that's very difficult for a lot of our agency partners to work with, and we understand that we can be a bit challenging in that way. And so that, the ability to be flexible in terms of resourcing is really, really important. And it's
For one thing.
also important to us, as you guys know very well, that we have a set budget. And, even though we need to be flexible and we need to change, we still have the one budget that we have to deal with. So a flexible partner who is also keeps budget in mind, because I think a lot of people will be able to respond quickly, but not necessarily economically. And I think that's really a key for us in kind of building those long-term partnerships.
You and your team have been such amazing long-term partnerships. I do think a long-term view is a big part of it, and managing the flexibility is a big part of it. But early on in our relationship, we almost blew it and really almost ended the relationship because we screwed up on the budget level. And I remember, I can't tell you the number of times under a classic agency model where budget management has been such a challenge, and lack of transparency around budget, lack of transparency about where we're at on the budget, what's about to come, and really a lack of empathy for the client who internally is being measured on a performance level on how well you're managing your budget. Now, you were an amazing client because you went to bat for some of the overages on those projects because they were overages. The, that always happens on projects. Our mistake a decade ago was not communicating those overages proactively enough, and we certainly in our relationship have learned on that. But you did go for bat on that, but that has an internal cost involved in it. And so when I'm talking about the triangle of quality, your team is killer on quality. You want the best work. Your team has a budget that they need to manage. There's some flexibility in that budget, but we can't exceed it. And time, to what you said in your opening comments, is often critical because you're in a very reactive market where the market is in a lot of flux right now. And so we've been trying to find a solution, and Fed's team's really added to that in how do we flexibly, with a very reasonable and even cost efficient budget, sort of deliver against all of those pieces. So kudos to you, but that's a little bit more background to people and how that's going. Chelsea, let me ask you. So, can you think of some examples of where a project has gone well because we've actually worked together on this model? What made
Um,
that project work well? How did you operationalize it? How do you get a team in Buenos Aires working successfully with a team that has speed needs, quality needs, branding needs, all of those pieces?
yeah, I think the biggest thing that kind of building out this global creative studio has really helped us with is the ability to scale. So often there were times where requests would come in and, we weren't able to resource it, and you end up saying no, or you end up saying we can't do this in that time frame. Would that work? And working with our studio partners now in this model has allowed us to say yes to pretty much all the work. We don't have that resourcing issue like we used to, and that alone has really kind of changed the game for us. So, in terms of, I know we mentioned this in the last question I was answering, but all our studio partners are vetted. We have a pretty strict process with how we bring them on board, how we deliver brand guidelines, how we onboard them to a client, a brand. That's all kind of built into our workflow, which make things streamlined, efficient. Um, but in terms of projects going well, a lot of it is coming just from that ability to scale and to say yes. And the more work that we've been able to say yes to, the more clients are coming back to us. We're able to
Right.
meet deadlines, and that's been huge. So the quicker we've been able to work, the more resources we've been able to bring on because we have that ability to scale up. That really has, not only helped our relationship with partner studios and just getting onboarded to the client, but it's also really helped our relationship with a lot of clients. And we're becoming more of a go-to because, we're saying yes to work, we're able to meet deadlines. So, I think the scalability of it and the flexibility of it has been one of the most successful things for, the client, our teams, and yeah, I rambled a lot. Did that answer? Can I get more
That
specific?
no, you didn't ramble at all. That was a great answer, and it actually brings me into. I want to share another slide. Let me just see if that's successfully coming up. Um, because it partially comes down to, what is the work? What is the budget? What is the timeline for the work? And so that's triaging, which is, right in your alley. It's classic marketing operations, best performance. And this is an example of a triaging grid. And the four questions that we really like to ask when we're working with a client to understand, um, you know, what is the tier one work that you need to do, and that's likely done by your internal team. And you actually want to be able to free up resources for the team that is closest to your brand, closest to your customer, closest to your market to be able to do that. And then, what work falls into that tier? What resources do you have to apply to that tier? Sometimes, you might have a priority corporate project that sucks all of your resources, regardless of skill level, into it because it's an immediately reactive piece. And I'm thinking about messaging when logistics changed overnight with COVID, or really the last 6 months with tariffs changing for cross-border shipping, right? All of those are sort of like all hands on deck messaging and communications opportunities. But there's often work that, in fact, is very important work. It's important that it gets done. It's part of the overall strategy, but it can also be outsourced much more efficiently, which can reduce bottlenecks in what you're doing. And part of that's really understanding in your agency partner and your internal resources. How well do they collaborate? Number one, do you understand their capabilities and capacities? And have you built a robust, scalable, flexible system that can fill those gaps? And that brings me to a question for you, Fed, which is, what kinds of creative projects, what kinds of formats, what kinds of work do you love the most, and which ones can you handle efficiently in your studio for clients?
Hmm, good question. So the ones that we like the most are probably the ones in which we have some sort of creative freedom, right? In which
Mhm.
the ones in which we can conceptualize, uh, find a way of bringing something new to the table, maybe challenge a little bit the client. Uh, those who start with a more of a blue sky thinking, and then they funnel down, so to say, to something more concrete. Those are the ones that we love the most, and I think especially my team, right? I mean, because I'm probably speaking on behalf of my team, because I
Of
know how
course.
their eyes spark when they get a project in which they have some creative freedom and they can just like fly and conceptualize and then bring it back, bring it back home, bring it back to something more concrete. And those are probably the projects that we like the most. And then those, I need to be honest, those come up, once in a while, only once in a while.
Right.
Sometimes, sometimes, either the client has like a very specific needs, or a very clear idea of what they want. And I think it's a skill from our side to understand, when do we have some space to push that boundaries or not, or when do they need something to be delivered, really quickly, or just like making some tweaks. And that's, I think it to understanding and to knowing when to push or not. That's almost like an art, so to say. It's a project direction and client management art. But back to your question, I think yes. I think the ones in which we like the most are the ones in which we have the possibility to fly a little bit and then come back to something more concrete, let's say.
Which is an amazing answer because you've got an amazing creative team. And and as we said earlier, it's a creative team with a global perspective of around what great work is. The answer really matches to understanding where does the project fit in terms of tiering it against, do we want lots of collaboration on this project? Do we want some blue sky thinking? Or do we really just need to do a lot of execution against this box that has already been established? And that really becomes the creative operations role to communicate that clearly. There's nothing more frustrating for a client if it's work that they just understand. It's real straightforward work. They want a lot of execution. They want it on budget and on time, and they need that project started. They don't really want to revisit the strategy or revisit the platform creative platform. It's important to be able to identify that and find a partner who can do it and do a lot of that work. And to your point, your teams do that work really, really well. Flip side, there are moments where, in fact, the client is looking to explore, wants creative collaboration, and so you need to be able to understand the triaging of the work to be able to deliver that. And Stacy's teams are the gamut of that. Sometimes they want back and forth. They don't really know the answer. The brief might not even really be that robust yet. And so they need a bit of creative exploration to get to a better brief. And I always hate it when the agency says the brief isn't good enough, because they're really saying is our partnership isn't good enough to work together to develop the brief in the right way. The agency partner, our network should be sitting on the bench with you trying to solve the problem, as opposed to as an opposition, which is sort of criticizing your process. Because sometimes we all would love a better brief, but sometimes things are moving so quickly, or the challenge is so nebulous, or the answer is just not clear enough that we need some exploration. And so the ability to resource at different tiers, the ability to execute against the quality, creative exploration, to execute against a budget, or to execute against the timeline really adds a ton in that area. Stacy, I've got a question for you to ladder on that. And it's really about managing expectations internally. So you've done a great job of building a big team. Your team knows what they're doing. They adore you. They adore working with you. They adore the kind of work they're doing. You've also built great external partnerships, not just with us, but you've got a roster of external partners. How do you manage expectations internally when you're working with internal people to execute, when you're working with external people to execute? How do you communicate and manage those expectations from a client perspective using a flexible resourcing environment?
Yeah, so we're kind of constantly having the conversation around timelines, as you can imagine, because I think there's a lot of I think this is common across the board, but there's a misconception that marketing has people that are just sitting there waiting to execute something for another
Right.
area of the organization. So, a lot of conversations are around, to do this properly, we need X amount of time, and that's a big part of my job, leading the team. So I no longer do the work anymore, but my job is to try and create the right situation that sets them up for success. And and sometimes when the ask is bigger, people don't understand, like the other teams around us don't understand that the ask is bigger. And so my job is to go and kind of educate them on all the pieces that will be involved in that, and at a high level, in a way that people can understand. So it's kind of constantly having that conversation, and understanding that we get in touch with, we'll get in touch with you guys right away and go, this is coming down the pipe. I don't know quite where we're going with it yet, but and try to give you guys a heads up, and maybe start turning, so you, like as you say, your team is involved with a lot of problem solving for us. So get you guys thinking about the question too, to start like saying, well, is there something that we won't think of here that you guys will know or have experience with? So that is a part of every conversation, and trying to be,
Right.
sometimes, and I'll say to my team sometimes, this one we have to deliver. So let's reprioritize other things, like constantly have
Hmm.
that reprioritization happening too. So where is there things that have flexible dates versus not? Like, again, being part of the conversation, when tariffs were changing a lot earlier this year, and being part of that conversation was really important. And so what are some of the things that can slide a little while, until we're not as quite as data driven as some of the other things. So that it's a constant part of the role, is that internal education and communication, and then making sure the team knows when we have something that we have to absolutely deliver on at that time, and that you're taking other things off their plates too, to make sure that we get that done.
Yeah, I hear lots in your answer, right? You're being a good partner internally, so you're trying to find ways to say yes. It's really understanding the ask and what might be delivered, needed to deliver against the ask, and educating people around what really is in an ask that they might think is easy but is more complex, or it needs more stakeholders, or it needs to fit brand guidelines, or it's maybe even not as big a priority as they think it is versus what the organizational priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
And then matching that to timing, setting timing expectations and managing that timeline. How much time do you spending with internal stakeholders talking about who and where the work is getting done by, right?
Not much, to be
Almost
honest.
not
Yeah, not
much.
much.
It's not what they care about internally. What they care about is the quality of the work. But even before the quality of the work, they care that you've got the flexibility to be able to say yes in some shape or fashion, and to help them prioritize that work against the organization. I think that's a huge insight about how your flexible resourcing and how you've been able to scale your output so successfully, because really you haven't had a lot of hires over the last 5 years into the organization, but the output needs have definitely increased. I think you can share that pain with everybody because you're probably not alone, right? In this economy, most organizations have not been growing over the past 5 years. They've been asked to do more with less. Chelsea, let me ask you, um, how, when you're working across geographies, how are you ensuring quality control and brand consistency on client work? But how are you also matching the challenge that Stacy's feeling, right? Which is, I need to deliver for internal stakeholders. I need to understand better what the project is, and I really quickly need to reach out and get a sense of how are we going to make this happen for them? How do you do that and yet still make sure that we're delivering a quality product so that we hit that side of the triangle as well?
Yeah. Every time a new project starts, we open up with a brief. So there's always a briefing process that's involved. Whoever the creative team is that's going to be supporting with the project is always involved with that briefing. They're part of the estimating process. We're very transparent on our estimates, our scopes, with exactly what the client is getting. So, and we usually take the time to make sure that, we're reviewing those estimates, giving them time to kind of look at them and, respond with any questions back. But I'd say, you know, that's a huge initial part of the project, the process. That's where you're going to agree on the terms, agree on what everyone's delivering, agree on timelines, and making sure both teams are, understanding the scope of work and exactly, what is going to be outputted. So, that part to me can't be skipped. And I think sometimes there are times where, on my end, I can tell it's going to be a bigger, maybe more complex project. And I will make sure that there's, a lot more detail in the estimate, in the scope, to account for things that maybe are not being thought about from a creative standpoint. So, again, the whole going back to kind of how we agree and how we hit all the things that we're delivering on, that all comes back to making sure that when we initially kick off the project, that we're scoping it correctly, that, if there's not a brief in place, that we're making sure we're aligned on deliverables and exactly, what steps are involved in those deliverables. In terms of, the quality assurance, that's always baked into the process. So, nothing's ever going to the client without QA. And if it does, that's a mistake, and it really shouldn't happen. But there's always that baked into the process. So everything's always being reviewed, whether it's proofing or from a creative director, that's all part of the process. But I think, the bigger thing to note with Brainrider is that, back to my point of, we've vetted all our studio partners, they're fully aligned with kind of Brainrider's standards and, in terms of creative quality and, client communications and just standards for delivery. So, we're really working with a group of people that, is fully aligned with our processes and understanding the QA that needs to happen, the comms that needs to happen. And this all goes back to just making sure you have really good workflows and processes in place, and it kind of really mitigates a lot of the risks on all those things.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome answer, Chelsea. And Ben has actually, we've got a question in from the attendees. Ben has asked, and I'm just going to read his question out for a second, and it's a question for Fed. And the question says, "Hi, question for Fed. In terms of creative exploration with a good brief versus prescriptive development and changes." Right? So tier one versus tier three, it would be one way to think about that. Do you find prescriptive work is a better way for clients to test the overall process with you before trying the creative exploration? So I think what
And
Ben's
now,
asking is, to get
yeah.
started with a client, right? To Chelsea's point, how do we find the right matching? How do you vet someone? In our case, we know your strengths, and so we can help guide that with a client. But when you're working fresh with a client, which is the best way to understand your team and your organization and what you're really great at?
I think I'm gonna hate the way I answer this question, but it's yes and no. I mean, it's yes because you get a sense of how this counterpart, like this agency they have in front of that you briefing, understands your needs. No, if it's a simple, more prescriptive brief, you would be able to get a sense of, okay, these people understand what I'm asking for.
Mm.
But you miss the possibility probably of understanding, I know, how we can fly, or where our exploration can take us. I mean, I would say more yes than no. Yes, I think because it's important just to get this chemistry and this understanding of how these people might be able to understand my needs. Yes, it's a good proxy, I would say, just to start with a small prescriptive project and see how quickly they turn around and how accurately they do it based on the original brief. Uh, I wouldn't say that is a proxy of how creative we could be, or this whatever agency could be. I hope I'm answering the question.
Oh, yes, you make lots of sense. We love starting with a small test project. I hate starting with an RFP or an extended selection process because they are so artificial. You don't really get to see the team in action. But a real live paid for project is an awesome place to get started. I think, Ben, part of your answer it really goes back to Stacy's point and Chelsea's point and Fed's point, which is it all depends on client need. And so really, what's the what is the work that needs to get done? How much collaboration is needed in that work? What skills will be needed to get that? And if you're overall going to need fairly prescriptive work, it's okay to say that and say that's the partnership that I'm looking for. If it's a mix, it's okay to say that too. And if you're actually looking for to increase your creative chops, whether it's with a more global perspective or a Latin, in Fed's case, a Latin global or Latin American perspective, I think I would be transparent around that. So really, and Chelsea helps clients understand their needs and express their needs in a way that the studio partners can hear them, which is why that triangle of working together can be so successful. So I love your answer, a little yes and a little no, Fed, because it really is what's the client need, and then we'll adapt to that to bring you on stream and have things. Now, questions are starting to come in. There's another one that says, matching energy thanks to time zone overlap is a huge benefit. That's a great insight. Are there any other key advantages that nearshoring offers over remote offshoring in a far-flung country? So, what does like a global creative that gets North America team offer versus someone who's just selected based on price? And who wants to
Um,
tackle that one? Go ahead, Fed.
I think, yeah, I think time zone it's a big one, and also, of course, language, right? I mean, the people that we work with that have like the relationship with Brainrider, they are fluent in English. Uh, but also idiosyncrasy, I would say. There's,
Yeah.
I mean, we are like far away, way down under, like very very far away from the North American market, but we are within America, right? Like America, it's not the U.S. America is like the whole continent, and we are part of the American continent, and we get that, I would say social influence or cultural influence, of the North American, market. We get it. I mean, we're deeply influenced, I would say, in comparison to someone in India, I would say, or maybe, the Philippines. I mean, we are not only in the same time zone, but we kind of consume. We have like a cultural consumptions are, are similar as well, and that brings us closer to counterparts in the US.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Like really what it is that you are part of a global creative team. So it's less about geography. Geography affects time zone, and working overnight with someone who's not energized is a bummer. And it's often what people really have hated about offshoring is that time gap is just makes it hard to be reactive and effective and on timeline the way that Stacy was talking about. But you also need to choose a team that is embedded in North American culture to be able to get there, has visited, has worked in Miami or worked in your case in London or worked in New York, who visits and understands and consumes in a very similar way. And when I was in Buenos Aires, the first thing that I noticed is I didn't feel like I was in Latin America at all. In some foreign destination, I felt like I was in a Latin America that was really New York City. And I
Hmm.
was so comfortable talking with everyone, interacting with one. We all understood each other. So it's not even just a language issue, although I think you want to make sure people can understand each
Yeah.
other. That's table stakes. I think really what your team offers as a global creative team is that you get it. And so the shorthand in those conversations around design or execution or need really fit because you're doing work for other North American clients
Yeah.
Not just a one-off studio that's been set up and hired for an individual. It's a really, really talented team. So I think that's a really great benefit. Chelsea, what are some of the, as we've done the exploration around how do you do nearshoring successfully, what are some of the feelings you've had about location or team that works best?
Yeah, we've definitely worked in a lot of different time zones, and we've kind of it's been trial and error of which have worked best in terms of some time zones being really ahead, and then you do get into a spot where sometimes that works really well, but we're also finding that it was also sometimes the most challenging aspect of the relationship. Um, I'd say, with Brainrider, working specifically with Brainrider, one of the bigger advantages is that, nothing is hidden from everyone. You're not going to work with Brainrider and
Right,
feel I'm working, with Brainrider with a different team that's somewhere else. Like that's not the case. The same way, Fed is on this call now, he's on client calls with us. The team that you're working with,
right.
it's small, you have direct access to everyone. It's not going to feel like, you're coming into Brainrider and then being pushed to another team. It's very much going to feel like you're working with the Brainrider team. And that's at least what we strive for. So please give us any feedback if it doesn't feel that way. But that I think is the biggest advantage. You know who you're working with, you know who's the creative on your project, you know who the creative director is, you've had calls with them, you have that point of contact. It's not going through me, through someone else. You have that direct line of contact. So, I think that's the biggest advantage with Brainrider in this model, and the time zone and not being too far ahead or too far behind definitely, really helps that relationship portion of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great insight, which is regardless of where you're located, you're not trying to build a machine that's putting out widgets. The creative and marketing process is really about people, understanding the market, understanding the need, and applying creativity and marketing smarts, communication smarts to all of that. And so you're not, it's different than outsourcing code or outsourcing back end work or outsourcing accounting. This really takes an understanding and a collaboration at an individual people level, which is why I love the studios that we work with because they're great. And I love the clients that we work with because they're great. And Chelsea, I really love the way that you've been figuring out this model because it's been a true exploration. We have made lots of mistakes and we have got lots of learning, but over the past couple of years of this journey, I'm really feeling confident that it's a brilliant way to add that flexibility that Stacy talked about, to add global creative resourcing in a way that fits your timeline and your budget and your quality needs. Throw in a last question, and I might be able to fit it in, but I'm also going to wrap us up a bit and say thank you. Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Fed, and thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, Ben, and everybody who asked questions, and thank you, everybody who participated. You're all awesome. So that pat on the back, I want to see the three of you do a pat on the back now, right? I'll do it too, right? Because sharing is hard work, and you've all got great experience. And if you're on the call and you want to figure out how to deliver, how to scale, how to get more done with less, or if you're intimidated by the idea of working with global creative talent, but you're also intrigued by it, we'll share those lessons with you. We work with studios in Toronto and Vancouver, creative talent in the US, Cape Town, Buenos Aires, and they're all amazing and they've all done great work for clients. But there's also been a journey that's been involved in figuring that out. And I won't sell you, but I definitely will share that journey and sort of point out some areas where, based on our experience and our learning together. And one last piece, and I'm going to put up my last slide of the day, and that is we love feedback. So, um, I'd love to talk to you if you've got questions, but we'd also love to keep the conversation going so that we can get your feedback on today's session, questions we didn't get to, areas you'd love to explore in future presentation. And I actually was enjoying the conversation so much, I didn't flip to all the poll questions or all the resources that Daphne and our team had made available, but you can scan that code and access them. And there are cheat sheets and strategic frameworks and planning guides that can sort of help you scale what you're doing under a bunch of different models. That's it. I think what we've got. Thanks to everybody. You were awesome and very useful. I loved the conversation. I got lost in it a few times because you're so interesting to listen to. Big thanks to Theo and Henry Stewart for today's webinar, and most importantly, thanks to all the participants.